Any charting software needs to read in data, and how that data is set up matters. In this tutorial, we'll discuss what Data Storyteller expects in terms of how your data is organized and show some examples. We'll also discuss the concepts of dimensions. And we'll show the data sets in Apple numbers, because for this, it's easier if I can show multiple data sets at the same time, and a spreadsheet program is pretty useful for that. For Data Storyteller, there are basically three ways to organize data for 1.0. A single series with multiple dimensions, multiple series with a single dimension, and multiple series with multiple dimensions. And let's talk about headers for a moment. Headers are descriptive labels that usually appear at the top of columns and at the beginning of rows. And that's where DS expects to find them. For the moment, that's the only place they can be, but in the next beta, you'll be able to have a different row or column be a header. But for now, row 1 and column A is it. Okay, so here's an example of a single series. It's New York weather over time. The weather is the single series, and all the columns relate to that. You can plot the min and max values separately, as we did in the sample files tutorial, but ultimately they describe the same thing. So it's a single series. Another example is this file where we have a list of movies and some stats about each movie. The list of movies is the single series, and the other columns have data about those movies. And technically, in this case, the header is the title column. And so the way this is set up currently, this wouldn't work, but again, that will be fixed soon. But again, single series, columns that have data relating to that single series, and that's a single series. Multiple series with a single dimension is the default for Data Storyteller, as it's a very frequent arrangement of data. You have headers, and each column is a separate, unrelated thing. In this case, 5 different companies. Because they're unrelated, you could show this chart with one or all of these, and it would still make sense. But since they all have one column, or data stream, as the case may be, we say it's one-dimensional. Technically, there's 2 dimensions when you consider the header file, or the header column over here, but as far as the series themselves, they just have a single dimension, just this one column. The last is multiple series with multiple dimensions. This is a little less common, especially in this format. Here we have unrelated series, as we do with the previous data set, but they each have 4 dimensions or attributes. There's 4 columns that relate to each series. The year, the number of units sold, the revenue, and the revenue adjusted for inflation. All of these apply to each data series. And the data series are the media: cassette, CD, download, vinyl, etc. So now let's talk about how this works in Data Storyteller and how we can use the dimension panel to get our data displaying. It's probably easiest to start off with the multiple series, multiple dimensions dataset. In this case, every 4 columns is a new series, but the columns all represent the same thing: the years, the units, revenue, etc. And it's the same for each series. The year for cassettes, the year for CDs, the year for albums, for vinyl records, and of course that repeats: units for cassettes, units for CDs, units for the downloads. And so it's just those 4 columns repeat for each series. But what does that mean in Data Storyteller? So let's head over to Data Storyteller and we'll see what that means. First thing, we need to set up our data set. You can see we have the multiple series, multiple dimensions here. And this does not have row headers. The column A is actually the year for cassette, so we're going to turn off row headers. And then we're going to come down to the chart, and we're going to go to the dimensions panel, and we're going to enable the dimensions controls. And you'll see it's set to multiple series 1 dimension, which is the default. But that is not what we have here, so we want to change that to multiple series, multiple dimensions, and then set channels to 4 because we have 4 dimensions. And before we set things up, let's just set everything to not used. Actually, we'll just leave these as is. And as you can see, the dimensions panel has 4 channels: X, Y, size, and color. And as mentioned, there's the dimensions drop down that sets how many columns your data has. In this case, it's 4. And of course, it doesn't have to be 4, it could be less than that, but in this case, it's 4. And now if I click on any of the drop downs, you can see that column 1 through 4 is shown, which means I can set any of the 4 columns in my data to this attribute, to this channel. And the same goes for any of the 4 channels. And whatever column you select, the data is going to drive that attribute. So this is easiest to see with X and Y. If I set X to column 1, which is the years, you can see that this has already populated the years along the X-axis. And for the Y column, I'm going to set it to column 3, which is the revenue. And so now you can see the revenue values here. And if I preview this, you can see what the revenue looks like for each of the media types. And if I set it to column 2, which is units sold, that will change. I mean, it looks pretty much the same because units sold and revenue are probably going to go hand in hand. But we'll switch this back to revenue. But I'm going to use units sold for the size channel. So I'll select column 2 for the size. And I want to change that a little bit. So I'll go back to data visuals. I'm going to set this to say 20. And you can start seeing that our chart here is making some sense. The colors represent each individual media type. The size represents the unit sold, and the X represents year, and Y represents the revenue. Let's talk for a second about how the dots are getting sized up. First off, we size up your data to figure out the min and max value. We put that on a scale, and then we align that with the color gradient, or in the case of size, 1 to the maximum size value that you set in data visuals. Now remember, I set 20 in the data visuals panel, so in the case of our chart, we're going from 1 to a size of 20. So if the range is 1 to 1000, 1 is going to be the smallest size and or yellow, and 1000 is going to be the largest size and or red. But what if you have something in between? Say there is a value of 250. Well, that's going to be 25% of the maximum point size for the dot, and it's going to be more of an orange color because it's going to fall 25% of the way through this gradient. And if I have a value of 600, that's going to be 60% of the way between 0 and 1000. So I'm going to get a dot that's about 60% the size of the maximum, and then also this kind of burnt orange color that's about 60% of the way through the gradient. So again, we're just aligning the min and max of your data up to the min and max of the size and the left and right of your gradient. So hopefully that all makes sense. It should be pretty clear once you start playing with it. And so now we can go back to Data Storyteller, and we're going to use the color channel, and we're going to set the color channel to column 4. And remember, this is revenue that's been adjusted for inflation. So you're going to see something kind of interesting here when I do that, is that the Y value is representing the hard number of the revenue, but the color is now representing the revenue adjusted for inflation. So you'll see that back here in the late 70s, these vinyl sales were actually equivalent to CDs around the early 90s. And so this is just an example of one of the fun things that you can kind of see when you're kind of playing around with data that might not be super obvious if you're just looking at a huge spreadsheet. And one last thing I want to point out is that in the color gradient, when you have a color channel set, it's going to show this widget underneath the color control. And what this is showing you is all these lines are data values, and the black dot is the median. So this makes it a little bit easier to see where your data is and determine how you want to set your color points. In this case, we have data all the way through the spread here, but in a lot of cases, all the data is clustered in a certain area, whether it's in the middle or to one end or the other, and you want to pull in the color points to kind of frame that data. This is something to be aware of, and you can change this to have the colors better represented on your charts. All right, and then you can save to go back out to After Effects, and your chart will be there. And that's about it. So if all this is a little confusing, shoot us an email at beta@digitalanarchy.com. We're open to suggestions on how to make it clearer and or understanding what you're having trouble with. So thanks for checking it out, and like I said, email us if you have questions.